The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, and in that frozen moment of silence, my mother-in-law's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We all know what you really are. A gold digger who trapped my son." 200 wedding guests turned to stare at me in my white dress, and I felt my carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Then the rumble of an engine outside made everyone's head turn toward the entrance, and my father stepped through those doors in a way that would change everything they thought they knew about me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alexandra Chun, and 3 weeks ago I turned 28 years old in my small apartment in Portland, Oregon, eating takeout Chinese food alone because my fiancé was working late again at his family's investment firm. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the culmination of 3 years of planning, compromising, and trying to prove myself worthy to a family that had decided from our first meeting that I would never be good enough for their precious son. The Grand Meridian was everything I had never allowed myself to dream about. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Willamette River, crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across white linen tablecloths, and arrangements of white peonies and garden roses filled every corner with their delicate fragrance. My dress, a custom creation of silk and French lace that had taken 6 months to make, felt like wearing a cloud. Everything was perfect, elegant, expensive, and completely paid for by my new in-laws, a fact that Vivian Ashford Montgomery, my mother-in-law, never let me forget. The reception had been underway for barely 30 minutes when it happened. I was standing near the head table, having just finished greeting a group of my husband's college friends, when I heard glass breaking. The sound was sharp and deliberate, not the accidental clink of celebration but the intentional destruction meant to command attention. I turned to see Vivian standing in the center of the dance floor, her Valentino gown shimmering under the lights, one hand still extended from having thrown her champagne glass to the ground. Her husband, Charles Montgomery III, stood beside her looking uncomfortable but not surprised, which told me everything I needed to know about whether he had been warned this was coming. "I apologize for the interruption," Vivian announced, her cultured voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent room. "But I simply cannot stand here another moment and pretend that everything about this wedding is not a complete farce." My husband, James, had been across the room talking with his best man. I watched his face go pale as he began pushing through the crowd toward his mother, but she held up one perfectly manicured hand to stop him. "No, darling, you have been blinded by pretty features and sweet words long enough. Someone needs to speak the truth, and it appears that responsibility falls to me." I felt frozen in place, unable to move or speak as every eye in the room turned from Vivian to me and back again. Among the guests were partners from Charles's private equity firm, members of the Portland Symphony Board that Vivian chaired, families whose names appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings, and my own small contingent of friends and family who looked as horrified as I felt. My mother, sitting at a table near the back, had half risen from her chair, her face stricken. My younger brother, Marcus, looked ready to charge forward, held back only by my mother's hand on his arm. "This woman," Vivian continued, gesturing toward me with a sweep of her arm that somehow managed to be both elegant and contemptuous, "came into our lives 3 years ago with nothing to her name. No family money, no connections, no breeding whatsoever. She worked as an elementary school art teacher, for heaven's sake, making barely enough to afford her sad little apartment in that questionable neighborhood. And somehow, within 6 months of meeting my son at some pedestrian gallery opening, she had convinced him that she was his soulmate." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to highlight every insecurity I had harbored since the day James first brought me home to meet his family. I had known from that first dinner at their estate in the West Hills, sitting at a table that could seat 20 while a uniformed server brought course after course of food I could barely identify, that Vivian had assessed me and found me lacking. What I had not fully understood until this moment was just how much she hated me for daring to marry her son anyway. "Vivian, that is enough," Charles said quietly, but there was no real force behind the words. He looked embarrassed by the scene his wife was creating, but not angry enough to actually stop her. I realized with a sinking feeling that he agreed with her assessment, even if he would have preferred she deliver it with more discretion. "It is not enough," Vivian shot back. "We have been polite. We have been accommodating. We paid for this obscenely expensive wedding because James insisted, even though it galls me to spend our family's money celebrating his biggest mistake. We have smiled and pretended and welcomed this gold digger into our family, and I simply cannot do it anymore. Not without saying what everyone in this room is thinking but is too polite to say out loud. I found my voice finally, though it came out smaller than I intended. That is not fair. That is not true. I love James. I have never asked him for anything. Vivian laughed, a cold sound that had nothing to do with humor. You never had to ask, did you? That is how your type operates. You make a man feel like a hero for providing for you, for lifting you out of your sad circumstances, for giving you access to a world you could never enter on your own merit. You have been planning this from the moment you learned who James was and what our family is worth. James finally reached his mother, taking her firmly by the arm. Mother, stop this right now. You are humiliating yourself and embarrassing everyone here. Alexandra is my wife now, whether you approve or not, and I will not stand here and let you attack her at our wedding reception. For a moment I thought Vivian might actually strike her own son. Her face contorted with an emotion I could not quite name, something beyond mere anger or disapproval. She has poisoned you against your own family, she said, her voice dropping to something more dangerous than her earlier pronouncement. That is what women like her do. They isolate their targets, make them feel guilty for having wealth and privilege, and slowly drain away everything that matters until there is nothing left but dependence on them. That is a disgusting thing to say, James replied, and I could hear the tremor in his voice that meant he was truly angry now, not just embarrassed. Alexandra has never tried to come between me and our family. If there is distance, it is because of how you have treated her from day one. The criticism, the passive-aggressive comments, the way you seated her ex-girlfriend next to me at Thanksgiving dinner last year while making Alexandra sit at the opposite end of the table. She has endured all of it with more grace than you are showing right now. Vivian turned her attention back to me, and the look in her eyes made me take an involuntary step backward. Grace is easy when you are getting exactly what you want. A rich husband, a beautiful home, security for life. Tell me, what exactly do you bring to this marriage besides a pretty face? What can you possibly offer my son that justifies him shackling himself to someone so far beneath his station? The crowd had been murmuring throughout this exchange, a low buzz of shocked commentary and uncomfortable whispers. Now someone near the entrance gasped audibly, and the murmuring stopped entirely. I heard it before I saw it, the distinctive growl of a high-performance engine that cut through the tension in the room like thunder. Every head turned toward the ballroom entrance as the sound grew louder, closer, impossible to ignore. Through the glass doors that led to the circular drive, I could see a vehicle that did not belong in this moment. A Ferrari 812 Superfast in a shade of blue so deep it looked almost black in the fading evening light. The car pulled to a stop directly in front of the entrance, and the engine cut off, leaving a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. The driver's door opened, and my father stepped out. Robert Chun was not a tall man, barely 5'9", but he had a presence that made him seem larger. At 62, his hair had gone completely silver, which he wore slightly longer than was fashionable, brushed back from a face that showed every one of his years in the best possible way. He wore a Tom Ford tuxedo that fit him like it had been painted on, because it had been made specifically for him by craftsmen in Italy who knew his measurements by heart. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe Grand Complications watch that cost more than most people's houses. And on his feet were John Lobb Oxfords that he had owned for 20 years because he believed in buying quality and maintaining it properly. But it was not his clothes or his car or even his commanding presence that made the entire ballroom go silent. It was the way he moved through those doors like he owned not just the room but the entire city, with the kind of confidence that came from having built an empire from absolutely nothing and having no reason to prove anything to anyone. My father's eyes swept the room, taking in the scene in an instant. The broken glass on the floor. Vivian standing in the center of the dance floor with her son's hand still on her arm. Me standing alone near the head table in my wedding dress with tears threatening to spill down my carefully made-up face. And 200 guests frozen in various states of shock and fascination, watching this drama unfold like it was a particularly gripping episode of a television show rather than real people's lives. I apologize for my tardiness, my father said, his voice carrying easily despite not being raised. My flight from Singapore was delayed, And then there was an issue with customs that required my personal attention. I am grateful I arrived in time for the reception, even if I missed the ceremony itself. He walked directly toward me, and the crowd parted for him automatically, people stepping back to create a path without even seeming to realize they were doing it. He reached me and placed both hands on my shoulders, looking directly into my eyes with an expression that combined love, concern, and something that might have been anger, though not directed at me. "Are you all right, Alexandra? Your mother just texted me that there was some sort of commotion." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. My father turned to face Vivian, and his expression shifted to something colder, more appraising. "Mrs. Montgomery, I presume? We have not been formally introduced, though I have heard quite a bit about you from my daughter over the past 3 years. I regret that most of what I have heard suggested that this moment was inevitable. I had hoped Alexandra was being too sensitive, that she was misreading the situation. I see now that she was, if anything, understating the hostility she has been facing." Vivian's face had gone through several interesting color changes since my father entered the room. She had gone pale initially when she saw the Ferrari, then flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger when he walked in with such obvious command of the space. Now she seemed to be trying to regain her composure, drawing herself up to her full height and arranging her features into something approaching polite interest. "Mr. Chan, I assume? I am afraid you have arrived at an awkward moment. I was simply trying to have an honest conversation with your daughter about the realities of her marriage to my son. By calling her a gold digger in front of 200 people at her wedding reception," my father asked mildly. "That seems less like an honest conversation and more like a public humiliation. But perhaps we have different definitions of appropriate behavior. That would not surprise me, given what I know about your family's history." Charles Montgomery stepped forward for the first time, his discomfort evident in every line of his body. "Now see here, there is no call for insults. Vivian may have been somewhat indelicate in her timing, but she has legitimate concerns about this marriage. Your daughter, charming as she may be, comes from a very different background than our son. We wanted James to marry someone who understood his world, someone who could be an appropriate partner for a man in his position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father's expression did not change, but something in the air around him shifted, became more dangerous. My daughter comes from a background where she was taught the value of hard work, integrity, and treating people with respect regardless of their bank account balance. If that is considered inferior to inheriting wealth and using it as an excuse to look down on others, then I am quite proud of the different background she represents." "That is not what I meant," Charles protested, though he was already backing down, responding to some quality in my father's voice that suggested contradiction would not be wise. "I simply meant that there are practical considerations when two people from very different economic circumstances marry. Questions of prenuptial agreements, expectations about lifestyle, those sorts of things." "Ah yes, the prenuptial agreement," my father said, and now there was something almost amused in his voice. "I believe that was quite a point of contention, was it not? Alexandra told me that you insisted James could not marry her without one, which seemed to wound her deeply, not because she wanted access to your money, but because it suggested you believed that was her motivation for the marriage." Vivian found her voice again, sensing an opening. She was wounded by it? How convenient. Of course she would react that way, making James feel guilty for protecting himself and his inheritance. It is textbook manipulation, and my son was too infatuated to see it. "She was wounded by it," my father said quietly, "because she had been planning to insist on a prenuptial agreement herself, one that would protect James from any claim on her assets in the event of a divorce. She mentioned this to me several months before your family brought up the subject, asking me if I thought it would offend James to suggest such a thing. I told her that any man worth marrying would appreciate her desire to keep things equitable and clear." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. I watched confusion flicker across Vivian's face, followed by something that might have been calculation as she tried to work out what angle I could possibly be playing. "Her assets," she said finally, investing the word with subtle mockery. "What assets could an elementary school art teacher possibly have that would require protection?" My father smiled then, And it was not a kind expression. That is an excellent question, Mrs. Montgomery. I am glad you asked. Alexandra, have you not told your new in-laws about your trust fund? I shook my head mutely. My father had asked me repeatedly over the past 3 years why I had not disclosed my financial situation to James or his family. I had told him that I wanted James to love me for myself, not for my family's money, and that I had no desire to participate in the kind of social Olympics that seemed to consume so much of the Montgomery family's energy. My father had disagreed with this approach but had respected my wishes, even when it meant watching me endure treatment that made his blood boil. My daughter, my father said, addressing the room now rather than just Vivian, chose to live on her teacher's salary and maintain a modest lifestyle because she wanted to know that the man she married loved her for herself. She did not want her family's wealth to be a factor in her relationships or her sense of self. I respected that choice, though I often thought it unnecessarily difficult. However, I did not respect it enough to stand by while someone publicly humiliates her based on assumptions that are not just wrong but spectacularly, almost comically incorrect. He turned back to Vivian directly. You called my daughter a gold digger. You suggested she was after your son's money. You implied that she brought nothing to this marriage except a pretty face and mercenary intentions. So let me clarify a few facts that Alexandra, in her stubborn insistence on privacy, has chosen not to share with you. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. James had moved to stand beside me, taking my hand in his, and I could feel him trembling slightly, though whether from anger or shock I could not tell. My daughter's trust fund, my father continued, was established when she was born and has been carefully managed over the past 28 years. Its current value, including stocks, bonds, real estate holdings, and other assets, is approximately $43 million. She gains full control of it on her 30th birthday, though she has had access to the income it generates since she turned 25. That income, which she has been donating almost entirely to arts education programs for underprivileged children, amounts to roughly $1.2 million per year. I heard someone gasp, then another. James's hand tightened on mine, and I glanced at his face to see shock written clearly across his features. We had never discussed my finances in detail. He knew I came from a comfortable background and that my father was successful in business, but I had deliberately kept the specifics vague, and he had never pushed for details. Now I could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile it with the modest apartment I had insisted on keeping, the budget I had maintained, the way I clipped coupons and shop sales and got excited about finding a good deal on anything. In addition to her trust fund, my father went on, seeming to take satisfaction in each revelation, Alexandra owns, through various holding companies that I helped her establish, 3 commercial properties in downtown Portland, a 4-unit apartment building in the Pearl District, and a 20% stake in my company, Chang Global Technologies, which was valued at our last funding round at approximately $800 million. Her stake in that company is worth roughly $160 million on paper, though of course the actual value will depend on performance when we eventually go public or sell. Vivian had gone completely pale now, and Charles looked like he might need to sit down. Around the room, I could see wedding guests pulling out their phones, undoubtedly searching for information about Chung Global Technologies to verify what my father was saying. They would find it easily enough. My father's company, which designed and manufactured components for smartphones and computers, had been the subject of several recent articles in the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg regarding its potential IPO. So you see, Mrs. Montgomery, my father said, his voice still pleasant but with steel underneath, when you accuse my daughter of being a gold digger who trapped your son for his money, you are not just being cruel. You are being absurd. Your family's net worth, which I took the liberty of researching after I learned how you had been treating my daughter, is approximately $75 million. Quite comfortable, certainly nothing to dismiss. But my daughter's personal net worth, even before accounting for future inheritance, is nearly 3 times that amount. If anyone in this marriage is punching above their financial weight class, I am afraid it is your son, not my daughter. The ballroom erupted in noise as everyone began talking at once. I stood frozen, watching Vivian's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name. Shock, disbelief, anger, and then something that looked almost like fear as she realized how completely she had miscalculated. How thoroughly she had humiliated herself in front of everyone whose opinion mattered to her. James turned to me, his eyes searching my face. Alex, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were struggling financially? Why did you let my mother treat you like this for 3 years without ever saying anything to defend yourself? I found my voice finally, though it still shook slightly. Because I wanted you to love me. Not my money, not my family's name. Not what I could do for your career or your social standing. Just me. And I thought if your family knew, everything would change. Every interaction would be filtered through that knowledge, and I would never know if people cared about me or about what I represented. But I made you live in that tiny apartment, James said, and I could hear the distress in his voice. I let you keep working at that school even though the pay was terrible. I let my mother criticize your clothes and your car and everything else because I thought you were doing the best you could. If I had known. If you had known, it would not have mattered, I interrupted gently. I was doing the best I could with the life I chose to live. The apartment was never too small for me. I loved teaching at that school. The children did not care if my clothes were designer or if my car was new. They just cared that I showed up and cared about them. That life was real in a way that this, I gestured around at the opulent ballroom, sometimes is not. My father was watching this exchange with an expression that suggested both approval and concern. I supported Alexandra's decision to live modestly because I believed, perhaps naively, that it would help her find authentic relationships based on who she is rather than what she has. I did not anticipate that it would expose her to this sort of treatment from people who should have known better than to judge others based solely on apparent financial status. He turned back to Vivian, and his voice hardened. You pride yourself on your breeding, Mrs. Montgomery. You sit on charity boards and host fundraisers and cultivate an image of refinement and social consciousness. But the moment you encountered someone you perceived as beneath you, someone without the right pedigree or the right bank account, you revealed exactly how shallow that refinement truly is. You have spent 3 years belittling my daughter, undermining her relationship with your son, and doing everything in your power to make her feel unwelcome in your family. And you did all of this while operating under assumptions that 5 minutes of basic courtesy or genuine conversation would have corrected. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out weak and uncertain. We had no way of knowing. Alexandra never said anything about her background. She presented herself as a schoolteacher with limited means. What were we supposed to think? You were supposed to think that she was a kind, intelligent, accomplished woman who loved your son, my father said sharply. You were supposed to judge her by her character, her treatment of others, her obvious devotion to James. Instead, you judged her by the size of her apartment and the age of her car, and you found her wanting based on the most superficial criteria imaginable. That says far more about your character than it ever said about hers. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of the wedding planner, a frazzled-looking woman in her 40s who seemed uncertain whether to address the obvious tension or pretend everything was normal. Excuse me, but the kitchen is asking if we should proceed with serving dinner, or if you would prefer to delay. I looked around the ballroom at the faces staring back at me with expressions ranging from shock to fascination to second-hand embarrassment. This was supposed to be my wedding reception, a celebration of love and commitment, and the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Instead, it had become a spectacle, a public confrontation that would be talked about in Portland social circles for years to come. We should serve dinner, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Everyone is here. The food is prepared. And despite the unfortunate interruption, this is still a wedding reception, and I intend to celebrate my marriage. I turned to Vivian, who still stood in the center of the dance floor looking smaller somehow than she had when she began her tirade. You wanted to know what I bring to this marriage besides a pretty face. I bring loyalty. I bring honesty. I bring the ability to love your son without needing anything from him except his love in return. And I bring the understanding that family is not about money or status or breeding, but about showing up for the people you care about even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. I paused, gathering my courage for what I needed to say next. I also bring forgiveness, which you are going to need a great deal of if you want any relationship with your son going forward. Because James and I are married now, and that is not changing regardless of how you feel about it. You can accept me as part of your family and treat me with the respect you should have shown from the beginning, or you can continue as you have been and find yourself increasingly excluded from your son's life. That choice is entirely yours. The silence that followed was broken by my father's voice, quiet but clear. "Well said, Alexandra. I could not be more proud of the woman you have become." He turned to address the room one final time. "I apologize for disrupting what should have been a joyous celebration. The fault for that lies entirely with those who chose to create conflict rather than embrace happiness. To the rest of you, please enjoy your dinner and the festivities. My daughter has worked hard to create a beautiful event, and she deserves to have her wedding day be memorable for the right reasons rather than the wrong ones." With that, he moved to take his place at the head table, and the crowd, released from their frozen observation, began moving toward their own seats with a buzz of excited conversation that would undoubtedly continue long into the night. I watched my mother-in-law walk slowly back to her table, her husband's hand on her elbow, her head held high despite the humiliation she had just endured. Part of me felt sorry for her, but a larger part felt the satisfaction of justice finally served. She had spent 3 years trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me and everyone around us that I was not good enough. Now she knew the truth, and she would have to live with the knowledge of how badly she had misjudged the situation. James pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me in a protective embrace. "I am so sorry," he whispered against my hair. "I should have stood up to her sooner. I should have made it clear that her treatment of you was unacceptable. I let you down." I pulled back to look at him, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. "You stood up to her today when it mattered most. That is what I will remember." As we moved toward our seats to begin dinner, I caught my father's eye across the table. He nodded once, a gesture of approval and understanding, and I felt some of the tension begin to drain from my shoulders. The evening was not ruined, just transformed, and perhaps in the end that transformation was exactly what needed to happen. The truth was finally out, and now we could all move forward with honesty instead of assumptions, with knowledge instead of prejudice. Whether that would heal the rifts in our family or deepen them remained to be seen. But at least now everyone knew where they truly stood, and there would be no more pretending, no more false civility hiding genuine contempt. I had wanted to be loved for myself, and I had been. James had chosen me when he thought I had nothing, when his mother disapproved, when it would have been easier to walk away. That was worth more than any trust fund or property portfolio. But I was not sorry that the truth had come out. Not sorry that my father had arrived with his Ferrari and his devastating revelations at precisely the right moment to turn Vivian's attack back on itself. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to see the truth they refuse to acknowledge, and watching them realize how badly they had miscalculated. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is maintain your dignity while others lose theirs, secure in the knowledge that truth has a way of emerging exactly when it needs to, whether you force it or not. The dinner service proceeded with a surreal quality, waiters gliding between tables with plates of herb-crusted salmon and filet mignon while conversations buzzed with barely suppressed excitement about what had just transpired. I sat at the head table between James and my father, acutely aware that every eye in the room kept drifting toward us, watching for any additional drama or revelation. My mother had moved from her original table to sit on my other side, reaching over periodically to squeeze my hand in silent support. She had lived through these past 3 years alongside me, watching me endure countless small cruelties and calculated insults, never quite understanding why I refused to simply tell the Montgomery family the truth about my background. To understand how I had arrived at this moment, sitting in a designer wedding dress at a reception that had become a public spectacle, required going back 3 years to a rainy October evening in downtown Portland. I had been 25 years old, teaching art to second graders at Riverside Elementary School in Southeast Portland, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment in the Hawthorne district, and genuinely happy with my life. My apartment was small but charming, with hardwood floors I had refinished myself, and walls I had painted in warm colors that made the space feel inviting despite its limited square footage. My car was a 10-year-old Honda Civic that ran perfectly well and got excellent gas mileage. My wardrobe consisted primarily of clothes from Target and occasional splurges from Nordstrom Rack. By most objective measures, I was living a comfortable middle-class existence, not wealthy but certainly not struggling. What my neighbors and colleagues and casual acquaintances did not know was that this lifestyle represented a deliberate choice rather than financial necessity. I had grown up in a world of considerable wealth, the only daughter of Robert Chen, who had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan at age 19 with $200 in his pocket and a degree in electrical engineering from National Taiwan University. My father had worked initially as a technician for a computer manufacturer, spending his evenings and weekends designing improved components in the tiny apartment he shared with 3 other immigrants. Within 5 years, he had patented several innovations in circuit board design and started his own company with money borrowed from everyone he knew. Within 10 years, that company had contracts with major technology firms. Within 20 years, Chun Global Technologies was one of the leading suppliers of specialized components for smartphones and computers, with manufacturing facilities in 4 countries and annual revenues exceeding $500 million. I had grown up in a world where wealth was simply the background reality of existence. My childhood home was an 8,000-square-foot estate in the West Hills with views of Mount Hood, a tennis court my mother used twice, and a swimming pool that was heated year-round despite Oregon's climate. I attended Portland Academy, a private school where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary, where my classmates arrived in cars driven by personal drivers and spent spring break in European capitals. I learned French and Mandarin, took piano lessons from a professor at the conservatory, and spent summers at camps in Switzerland where we hiked in the Alps and discussed philosophy with counselors who held doctorates from prestigious universities. But I also watched my father work 70-hour weeks, missing dance recitals and parent-teacher conferences and family dinners because his company demanded constant attention. I saw how wealth changed people's behavior toward us, how suddenly everyone wanted something, whether it was a donation to their cause or an investment in their business or simply proximity to success they hoped might somehow transfer to them. I noticed how my mother's friends at the country club treated the staff, with casual dismissiveness that suggested they viewed service workers as somehow less human than themselves. And I began to feel deeply uncomfortable with the disconnect between the values my parents claimed to hold and the reality of how we actually lived. When I told my parents at age 16 that I wanted to attend public university rather than the Ivy League schools they were pressuring me toward, they were baffled but ultimately supportive. When I chose to major in art education rather than business or pre-law, my father worried but accepted my decision. And when I graduated and took a job teaching at an underfunded public elementary school for $38,000 a year, living in an apartment I could barely afford on that salary instead of the condo my parents offered to buy me, they struggled to understand but respected my autonomy. My father and I had numerous long conversations during those years about why I was making these choices. I tried to explain that I needed to know who I was separate from the wealth and privilege I had been born into, that I wanted to understand how most people actually lived, that I wanted my accomplishments and relationships to be authentically mine rather than products of my family's money. He listened, though I could see it pained him to watch me struggle with student loan debt I did not actually need to carry, to see me drive a car that was less safe than he would have preferred, to know I was working in a school where I sometimes paid for classroom supplies out of my own limited paycheck. The trust fund he mentioned at the wedding reception was real and substantial, established at my birth by my paternal grandparents and added to generously by my parents over the years. I had known about it since I was old enough to understand what it meant, had been told from childhood that I would have financial security regardless of what career path I chose. But I had also asked my father to restrict my access to it until I turned 30, wanting to spend my 20s living on my own earnings and making decisions based on what I actually wanted rather than what wealth made possible. The compromise we reached was that I would receive the investment income starting at age 25, which I could use however I wished, though the principal would remain untouchable until 30. When that income started flowing, roughly $100,000 per month before taxes, I found myself paralyzed by the decision of what to do with it. I did not need it for living expenses since I was determined to continue living on my teaching salary. I did not want to spend it on luxury items that would reveal my true financial situation. So I began donating it to arts education programs in underprivileged schools, funding supplies and visiting artists and after-school programs that gave children access to creative experiences they would never otherwise have. It felt good, felt purposeful, felt like I was using unearned wealth to create opportunities for kids who deserved them. And it allowed me to continue living the modest life I had chosen without the guilt of watching money accumulate while others struggled. Into this carefully constructed existence came James Montgomery on that rainy October evening 3 years ago. I had gone to a gallery opening in the Pearl District, a small show featuring local artists that one of my teaching colleagues had told me about. The space was crowded with the usual mix of art students, young professionals, and people who attended openings primarily for the free wine and cheese. I was standing in front of a large abstract canvas, genuinely trying to understand what the artist was attempting to communicate, when a voice beside me said, "I think it is supposed to be about the futility of modern existence, but honestly it mostly looks like someone spilled paint and decided to call it intentional." I had turned to find a tall man in his early 30s, with dark hair slightly disheveled from the rain, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked expensive despite their casual style. His smile was self-deprecating, inviting me to share the joke rather than feel judged for my own interpretation. "Maybe the futility is in our attempt to find meaning where none was intended," I replied, and he laughed, a genuine sound that made several people nearby turn to look. We spent the next hour walking through the gallery together, making up increasingly absurd interpretations of the artwork, and talking about everything from our favorite books to our opinions on whether Portland's reputation for excellent coffee was deserved or merely marketing. His name was James. He worked in finance. He had grown up in Portland but spent several years in New York before returning to the city he loved despite its rain. He was funny and thoughtful and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, asking questions about my teaching job with the kind of attention that suggested he was actually listening rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. When he asked for my number at the end of the evening, I gave it to him without hesitation. When he called 2 days later to ask me to dinner, I said yes immediately. And when he picked me up in his Tesla Model S, I felt the first small flutter of concern about the wealth gap between us, though I convinced myself it did not matter since I was not actually poor, just choosing to live modestly. That first dinner should have been a warning about what was to come. James took me to Le Pigeon, one of Portland's most acclaimed restaurants, where the menu featured items like foie gras and rabbit and other delicacies I recognized from my childhood, but had not eaten in years. He ordered wine without looking at the prices, asked knowledgeable questions about preparation methods, and seemed completely comfortable in an environment that would have intimidated most people on a teacher's salary. I found myself downplaying my own knowledge of fine dining, pretending to be more uncertain about the menu than I actually was, not wanting to reveal the extent of my experience with expensive restaurants. Over the course of our first month dating, I learned more about James's background. His family, the Ashford Montgomerys, were old Portland money, meaning they had been wealthy for multiple generations rather than having recently acquired their fortune. His great-grandfather had made the initial family wealth in timber in the early 20th century, his grandfather had diversified into real estate and banking, and his father had transitioned the family holdings into private equity and venture capital. James himself worked at Montgomery Capital Partners, the family firm, where he was being groomed to eventually take over when his father retired. He lived in a penthouse condo in the Pearl District with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, decorated with modern furniture that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. He drove not just the Tesla but also a vintage Porsche he kept in climate-controlled storage and drove on sunny weekends. He belonged to the Arlington Club, Portland's most exclusive private club, where membership was by invitation only and required family connections going back generations. His watch cost more than I earned in 6 months, though he wore it so casually that most people probably did not realize its value. And yet, despite all of this, James seemed remarkably down to earth in those early weeks. He was interested in my teaching stories, asking about my students by name and remembering details from previous conversations. He suggested dates that were thoughtful rather than just expensive, taking me to Powell's Books and Saturday Market and on hikes in the Gorge. He never made me feel inadequate about my apartment or my car, or my limited budget for dining out. When I insisted on paying for my half of our dates, he accepted gracefully rather than making it into an issue about his masculinity or financial capability. I fell in love with him gradually and then all at once, the way you fall asleep slowly and then suddenly finding yourself completely immersed. He was kind to waiters and baristas, generous with friends, devoted to his work while maintaining perspective that it was not the sum total of his identity. He read novels and went to plays and had opinions about architecture and urban planning. He made me laugh and challenged my assumptions and created space for me to be completely myself. Within 3 months, we were essentially living together, though I maintained my apartment out of some stubborn insistence on independence that he found charming rather than offensive. The first crack in our bubble appeared when James asked me to have dinner with his parents. We had been dating for 4 months, and he presented the invitation as no big deal, Just a casual family dinner so they could meet the woman he had been spending so much time with. But I could hear the tension underneath his casual tone. Could sense that this dinner mattered more than he was admitting. I should have told him the truth then, should have explained about my background so we could meet his family on equal footing. But I had been enjoying being loved as just Alex the art teacher, without the complications that wealth introduced into relationships. And part of me was curious about how his family would treat someone they perceived as beneath their social station, whether they would be kind or dismissive, whether their values aligned with what they claimed to believe. The dinner was at the Montgomery estate in the West Hills, a sprawling property not unlike the one I had grown up in, though their style was more traditional where my parents had favored contemporary design. A housekeeper answered the door and led us to a formal living room where James's parents waited, drinks already in hand. Charles Montgomery III was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Vivian Ashford Montgomery was beautiful in the way that very wealthy women often are, with a kind of carefully maintained appearance that required personal trainers and regular visits to expensive salons and access to the best cosmetic dermatologists. They greeted me with polite coolness, asking questions about my background that felt more like an interview than conversation. Where had I grown up? What did my parents do? Where had I attended university? What were my career ambitions? I answered honestly but minimally, explaining that I was from Portland, that my father was in technology and my mother was a homemaker, that I had attended Portland State University, and that I loved teaching and hoped to continue doing so for the foreseeable future. I watched their expressions shift subtly with each answer, watched them classify and categorize me as someone who was nice enough, but not quite what they had hoped for their son. The dinner conversation was polite but strained, with Vivian steering topics toward people and events I had no knowledge of, name-dropping country club members and charity board associates and vacation destinations in ways that emphasized how different our worlds were. When James mentioned that we had gone hiking in the gorge the previous weekend, Vivian's expression suggested she found this activity slightly distasteful, more suited to tourists than to people of their social standing. The evening ended with cool handshakes and promises to do this again sometime that felt entirely insincere. In the car driving back to my apartment, James was apologetic and embarrassed, explaining that his mother could be difficult but that she would warm up once she got to know me better. I believed him then because I wanted to believe him, because I was in love and optimistic and convinced that genuine connection could overcome superficial differences. Over the following months and years, I learned exactly how wrong that optimism had been. Vivian did not warm up. Instead, she launched a subtle but relentless campaign to undermine my relationship with her son and make me feel unwelcome in their family. The criticisms started small and indirect. Comments about how teaching was such admirable work, so important, even though it must be difficult to make ends meet on that salary. Observations about how she had always imagined James with someone who shared his passion for classical music or opera or whatever cultural interest I happened not to have extensive knowledge of. Stories about James's ex-girlfriends and their accomplished families, told in ways that emphasized everything they had that I supposedly lacked. As our relationship grew more serious and James began talking about marriage, Vivian's opposition became more overt. She called me at work to suggest that I was holding James back from opportunities he deserved, that someone with my limited means and connections could never be an appropriate partner for someone of his standing. She hosted dinner parties and seated James's ex-girlfriends beside him while relegating me to the far end of the table with spouses of business associates, who clearly had no interest in talking to a schoolteacher. She suggested to James that we should postpone any engagement plans because we were too young, moving too fast, did not really know each other well enough. Through all of this, I remained silent about my true background. Partly this was stubbornness, a refusal to prove my worth through my bank account rather than my character. Partly it was a test of James, wanting to see if he would choose me even when his family disapproved, even when it would have been easier to find someone they considered more suitable. And partly it was a recognition that once the truth came out, everything would change in ways I could not control or predict. James proposed on a beach in Cannon Beach at sunset, with a ring he had designed himself featuring a simple solitaire diamond set in platinum. It was beautiful and personal and everything I could have wanted. When he called his parents that evening to share the news, I could hear Vivian's strained congratulations through the phone, could hear her asking to speak with me, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. She told me how happy she was, how she hoped we would be very happy together. But her tone suggested she was reading from a script of appropriate responses rather than expressing genuine feeling. The engagement period that followed was perhaps the most difficult time in our relationship. Vivian took over wedding planning with an efficiency that bordered on hostile takeover, dismissing my preferences and ideas in favor of what she considered appropriate for a Montgomery family wedding. When I suggested a simple ceremony at the Japanese garden followed by dinner at a restaurant, she looked at me with barely concealed horror and explained that the family had certain obligations, certain expectations from the community, and we simply could not have some small informal affair that would reflect poorly on everyone involved. She insisted on the Grand Meridian despite it being far larger and more formal than anything I wanted. She hired the caterer and florist and band without consulting me, presenting each decision as already finalized when I tried to participate in the planning. She invited 300 guests to what I had imagined as an intimate gathering of close friends and family. And when I protested any of these choices, she smiled her cold smile and reminded me that she and Charles were paying for the wedding, so naturally they had some say in how their money was spent. The final insult came 3 months before the wedding when Vivian insisted that James sign a prenuptial agreement. She presented it as simple common sense, protection for both of us, something any responsible couple should do regardless of circumstances. But the terms she proposed were humiliating, suggesting that in the event of divorce I would receive nothing beyond what I had brought into the marriage, with carefully worded clauses that implied the Montgomery family wanted to ensure I could not profit from my relationship with their son. James was mortified and wanted to refuse, but I convinced him to sign. I told him that I did not need his money, that I had no intention of divorcing him, and that signing would at least stop his mother from using this issue as another weapon in her campaign against our marriage. What I did not tell him was that I had my own attorney drafting a separate prenuptial agreement that I planned to present at the same time, one that would protect my substantially larger assets from any claim he might make. I wanted that document ready as proof that I had never been interested in his money, that I had always intended to keep our finances separate and equitable. But I never got the chance to present it because my father's flight from Singapore was delayed by mechanical issues, causing him to miss not just the ceremony but nearly the entire reception as well. If he had arrived on time, if he had been present when Vivian began her public attack, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. Perhaps he would have intervened earlier, prevented the spectacle, found a way to de-escalate the situation before it reached its dramatic peak. Instead, he arrived at precisely the right moment to hear his daughter called a gold digger in front of 200 guests, and he responded with the devastating effectiveness of someone who had spent 40 years building a technology empire and learning exactly how to wield information as a weapon. He had transformed the narrative completely, turning Vivian's moment of public humiliation of me into her own humiliation, revealing assumptions that made her look not just wrong but ridiculous. Sitting at the head table now, watching waiters clear dinner plates and prepare for dessert service, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I thought about the choices I had made, the information I had withheld, the pride that had kept me silent even when speech might have prevented years of difficulty. I thought about James and whether he would forgive me for the deception of omission, for allowing him to believe something about my circumstances that was fundamentally false even if I had never explicitly lied. I thought about Vivian and whether there was any possibility of reconciliation now that the power dynamic between us had shifted so dramatically. Most of all, I thought about the lesson in all of this, the understanding that had been forming over these past 3 years and had crystallized tonight into something clear and actionable. Wealth itself was not the problem, nor was the lack of it. The problem was allowing others to define your worth based on their assumptions about your financial status, allowing yourself to be diminished by people whose values were so shallow that bank account balances determined how they treated other human beings. I had thought I was being noble by hiding my background, proving that I could be loved for myself alone. But perhaps I had actually been collaborating in my own diminishment, accepting mistreatment I should have challenged immediately, allowing cruelty to continue because I wanted to win some kind of moral victory. The truth was that I should have told James and his family about my background from the beginning, not because wealth should matter but because honesty matters, because allowing people to make decisions based on false assumptions is its own kind of manipulation. I had been so focused on not wanting to be loved for my money that I had created a situation where I was being hated for my supposed lack of it, and that was equally problematic. Real integrity would have been sharing the truth and trusting that the right people would value me for reasons that transcended financial status regardless of what that status actually was. As dessert was served, individual chocolate soufflés with raspberry coulis that probably cost more per serving than I spent on groceries in a week during my modest living experiment, my father leaned over and spoke quietly. "Are you all right, Alexandra? This is not how I hoped your wedding day would unfold." I considered the question seriously before answering. "I am not sure yet, but I think maybe it needed to happen this way. Maybe we all needed to stop pretending and start dealing with reality, even if that reality is uncomfortable and complicated." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You get your stubbornness from me, you know? Your mother has told me many times that we are both too willing to prove points rather than taking the easier path. I am proud of the principles that drove your choices these past years, even if I sometimes wished you had chosen differently." "I wished I had chosen differently too sometimes," I admitted. "But I learned things living the way I did. About what matters and what does not. About who I am when wealth is not shaping every interaction and opportunity. I do not regret the experience, even if I regret some of the consequences." My mother, sitting on my other side, joined the conversation. "What matters now is what happens next. How you and James move forward from here. How you build a marriage based on honesty now that all the secrets are out in the open." She was right, of course. The dramatic revelation was over, the public confrontation complete. Now came the harder work of actually dealing with the implications of everything that had been said and learned. Now came the conversations with James about why I had hidden my background, and whether he could trust me after discovering I had kept such significant information from him. Now came the decision about what kind of relationship, if any, was possible with his family going forward. Now came the challenge of building an authentic life together based on who we both actually were rather than who we had been pretending to be. The evening ahead would be long and difficult and nothing like the romantic wedding night we had planned. But perhaps it would also be the beginning of something more honest and sustainable. A foundation built on truth rather than convenient fictions. And perhaps that was worth the price of admission to this particular drama, worth the humiliation and difficulty and spectacle that would follow us both for years to come in Portland's wealthy social circles. I looked across the ballroom and found Vivian's face in the crowd, watching her sit rigidly at her table while friends and acquaintances who had witnessed her public shaming whispered and speculated around her. Part of me felt vindicated, satisfied that she had finally faced consequences for 3 years of cruelty. But another part of me felt an unexpected sympathy, recognizing that she had built her entire identity on her social position and perceived superiority, and watching that foundation crumble in a single evening must be devastating regardless of whether it was deserved. The question now was whether any of us could move forward from this moment with grace and maturity, or whether this dramatic revelation had simply replaced one set of problems with an entirely different but equally difficult set. The answer would unfold in the days and weeks and months ahead, as we all navigated this new reality where everyone knew the truth, and no one could hide behind comfortable assumptions anymore. The dessert course concluded with forced normalcy, guests consuming their chocolate soufflés while maintaining conversations that carefully avoided direct reference to the confrontation everyone had witnessed. The band, which had remained silent during the drama, resumed playing soft background music that filled the awkward spaces between stilted discussions. I could feel the weight of attention on our table, hundreds of eyes periodically glancing our direction to assess how we were handling the aftermath of such public upheaval. My wedding dress, which had felt like a dream earlier in the day, now seemed constrictive and heavy, a costume I was wearing in a performance that had gone catastrophically off script. James had barely touched his dessert, his fork moving the soufflé around his plate in abstract patterns, while his mind clearly processed revelations that had fundamentally altered his understanding of our relationship. His hand rested near mine on the table, close enough that our fingers occasionally brushed, but he had not taken my hand in his since we sat down for dinner. That small distance felt enormous, a physical manifestation of the emotional gap that had opened between us with the exposure of information I had deliberately withheld for 3 years. I understood his confusion and hurt, recognized that from his perspective I had allowed him to operate under false assumptions about fundamental aspects of who I was, but understanding did not make the distance any less painful. The evening's scheduled events loomed ahead of us with suddenly oppressive weight. There was supposed to be a cake-cutting ceremony in 30 minutes, followed by the first dance, then father-daughter and mother-son dances, toasts from the wedding party, and hours of celebration that now felt impossible to execute authentically. How could we cut a cake and smile for photographs when the foundation of our relationship had just been revealed as built partially on deception, even if that deception had been motivated by understandable concerns? How could I dance with my father while 200 guests watched and whispered about the dramatic revelation he had delivered? How could James dance with his mother after she had publicly attacked his wife and been systematically humiliated in response? I became aware that the wedding planner, whose name was Michelle and who had been managing events for wealthy Portland families for 2 decades, was standing discreetly beside our table, waiting for acknowledgement. Her expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she assessed the situation and tried to determine how to salvage what remained of the evening's timeline. She had undoubtedly dealt with difficult family dynamics at weddings before, but this particular disaster was likely exceptional even by her experienced standards. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said quietly, using my new married name for the first time, and the sound of it in this context felt surreal. "We need to discuss the schedule for the remainder of the evening. The cake is ready for cutting, and the photographer is asking whether you would like to proceed with that and the formal dances, or if you would prefer to modify the plan given the circumstances." I looked at James, trying to read his expression and gauge what he needed in this moment. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, and I recognized the signs of someone trying to maintain composure through sheer force of will. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of his life, and instead it had become a public spectacle that revealed uncomfortable truths about his family, his wife, and the assumptions he had been operating under throughout our relationship. "James," I said softly, waiting until he turned to meet my eyes, "what do you want to do? We can continue with everything as planned, or we can cut things short and let people leave early. This is your day too, and I do not want to make decisions without knowing what you need." He was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as though he was afraid of what might emerge if he allowed any genuine feeling to surface. "I want to talk to you. Actually talk, without 200 people watching and listening and recording every word on their phones to share on social media later. But I also know that if we leave now, if we cancel the rest of the reception, it will be the only thing anyone remembers about our wedding. Not that we got married, not that we committed our lives to each other, but that everything fell apart so spectacularly that we could not even finish our own reception." His assessment was accurate and depressing in equal measure. We were trapped by the machinery of the event we had set in motion, obligated to perform happiness and celebration, regardless of the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. The alternative was to abandon the reception entirely and confirm for everyone present that the dramatic confrontation had destroyed something fundamental in our relationship. Neither option was good, but one at least preserved some dignity and suggested we were resilient enough to continue despite difficulty. "Then we continue," I said, making the decision with more confidence than I felt. "We cut the cake, we do the dances, we maintain the schedule as planned. We can talk later as long as you need about everything that happened tonight and everything I should have told you years ago. But right now, in this moment, we show everyone that we are stronger than one difficult evening, that our marriage is not so fragile that it shatters the first time we face adversity." James studied my face for several seconds, searching for something I could not quite identify. "You are remarkably composed for someone whose secret just got exposed to everyone we know. Does nothing shake you, Alex? Do you ever feel uncertain or afraid? Or is that just another thing you learned to hide because showing vulnerability might reveal something you did not want people to see?" The words stung precisely because they contained truth. I had learned early in life to maintain composure in difficult situations, to project confidence and control even when I felt neither. It was a survival skill in the world I had grown up in, where showing weakness invited exploitation or dismissal. But James deserved better than a wife who performed strength rather than sharing authentic emotion, especially in a moment when our entire relationship was being redefined in real time. "I am terrified," I admitted, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "I am afraid that you will never forgive me for not telling you the truth about my background. I am afraid that everything between us was built on a foundation that cannot support the weight of who we actually are." I am afraid that your mother was right about me in a different way than she thought, that I am manipulative and dishonest even if my motives were not about money. And I am afraid that this night, which was supposed to be about celebrating our love and commitment, has instead revealed that maybe we do not know each other as well as we thought we did." Something in James's expression softened slightly, the rigid control giving way to something more human and accessible. "I am afraid too," he said quietly. "I am afraid that I have been naive, that I missed obvious signs that you were not who you presented yourself to be. I am afraid that I do not know how to reconcile the woman I fell in love with, who clipped coupons and got excited about sales at Target, with the woman who apparently has a net worth that makes my family look middle class. And I am afraid that my mother's behavior tonight has created a rift that cannot be repaired, that I am going to have to choose between my wife and my family in ways that should not be necessary." We sat in that shared vulnerability for a moment, acknowledging fears that could not be resolved immediately, but at least could be spoken aloud. Michelle, the wedding planner, waited patiently for our decision, her professional demeanor intact despite the unusual circumstances. Around us, the reception continued its awkward progression, guests finishing dessert and beginning to drift toward the bar for additional drinks, conversations growing louder as alcohol loosened inhibitions and made people bolder in their speculation about what would happen next. "We continue," James said finally, echoing my earlier statement but making it a mutual decision rather than something I had imposed. "We cut the cake, we dance, we finish what we started. But Alex, you need to understand that we are going to have very difficult conversations after tonight. About trust, about honesty, about what it means to build a life together when we apparently had very different understandings of basic facts about each other. I love you and I married you and I am not walking away. But I am also hurt and confused. And those feelings do not just disappear because we decide to smile for photographs." "I know," I said simply. "And I promise you no more secrets. No more strategic omissions or careful presentations of partial truth. Whatever you want to know, whatever you need to understand about me or my background or my choices, I will answer completely and honestly. Even if the answers are uncomfortable or reveal things I am not proud of." James nodded once, then stood and offered me his hand. "Then let us go cut our ridiculously expensive cake and pretend that everything is fine. We can fall apart later, in private, where we do not have to worry about someone recording our breakdown for social media entertainment." I took his hand and rose, acutely aware that every eye in the room was tracking our movement. Michelle spoke quickly into her headset, alerting the photographer and videographer that we were ready to proceed with the cake cutting. The band, receiving some signal I did not see, transitioned smoothly into upbeat music that suggested celebration rather than drama. And we walked together toward the elaborate 4-tier cake that had cost more than my first car, a confection of vanilla bean cake and champagne buttercream with fresh flowers cascading down one side. A creation that was almost too beautiful to destroy with cutting, but that was exactly what tradition demanded we do. The crowd gathered around the cake table in a loose semicircle, phones emerging to capture the moment despite the professional photographer positioned for optimal angles. I could see my mother standing near the front, her expression encouraging and supportive despite undoubtedly sharing my concerns about what tonight's revelations meant for my marriage. My father stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and I was struck by the contrast between my parents' relationship and what I had witnessed between James's parents this evening. My mother and father had weathered 4 decades together, building something solid and genuine that had survived business crises and cultural differences, and all the ordinary challenges that long marriages accumulated. They stood together united, while Charles and Vivian Montgomery stood at opposite ends of the gathering, physically separated by dozens of people, and emotionally distant in ways that seemed suddenly obvious now that I was looking for them. James and I positioned ourselves behind the cake, our hands joined on the knife handle in the traditional pose that symbolized our first task as a married couple. The photographer called out instructions about angles and smiles, trying to create images that would look joyful and romantic despite the tension evident in our shoulders and the forced quality of our expressions. I could feel James's hand trembling slightly where it rested over mine on the knife, could sense the effort it required for him to maintain the appearance of happiness for the benefit of the watching crowd. On 3, the photographer called. 1, 2, 3. We pressed down together, the knife sliding through the bottom tier of the cake with satisfying ease, cutting a slice that would be transferred to a plate for us to feed each other in the next portion of this ritual. The crowd applauded politely, the sound feeling hollow and obligatory, rather than genuinely celebratory. Someone called out a joke about making sure to be gentle, a reference to the tradition of smashing cake in each other's faces that had thankfully fallen out of favor in recent years. We both smiled mechanically and continued with the performance we had committed to completing. The caterer stepped in to finish cutting and serving the cake to guests while James and I each took a small forkful from the ceremonial slice. I lifted my fork to his mouth, and he accepted the bite with exaggerated appreciation that made a few people laugh. He returned the gesture, feeding me cake that tasted like nothing despite its undoubtedly expensive ingredients and expert preparation. My taste buds seemed to have shut down entirely, overwhelmed by stress and emotional exhaustion that made physical sensations distant and unimportant. Michelle appeared at my elbow as the cake cutting concluded, her tablet displaying the schedule that dictated our next steps. "The first dance is next," she said quietly. "The song you selected is cued and ready. The dance floor has been cleared, and the lighting is set. Whenever you are ready, we can proceed." I had spent weeks selecting our first dance song, considering dozens of options before settling on At Last by Etta James, a classic that felt romantic and timeless and perfect for the moment when we would dance together as husband and wife for the first time. Now that choice seemed almost mockingly inappropriate, the lyrics about finding true love after years of loneliness taking on an ironic quality, given the revelations that had just complicated our relationship so thoroughly. James must have been thinking along similar lines because he leaned close and whispered, "We could change the song if you want. Ask them to play something else, something that does not feel like it is making promises we are not sure we can keep right now." I considered the suggestion, tempted by the idea of choosing something less weighted with meaning, less fraught with implications about certainty and forever. But changing the song would be another concession to the difficulty of the evening, another way of allowing the confrontation with his mother to reshape what was supposed to be our celebration. "No," I said firmly. "We keep the song. Because those promises matter, James. The ones we made today during the ceremony, the commitment to stay together through difficulty, to work through challenges rather than running when things get complicated. This is exactly the kind of moment those vows were meant to address, and I refuse to let your mother's behavior make me doubt what we decided together." James looked at me with an expression that mingled surprise and something that might have been admiration. "You are stronger than I am," he said quietly. "I am not sure I could stand here and make these declarations about commitment and certainty if I had just discovered my spouse had been hiding something fundamental for our entire relationship." "I am not stronger," I corrected. "I am just more practiced at performing confidence when I feel anything but confident. You will learn that about me if you stick around long enough. If we manage to navigate our way through the mess I created by choosing privacy over honesty." The bandleader, a woman in her 50s with decades of experience reading rooms and managing the flow of wedding receptions, made eye contact with Michelle and received a nod indicating we were ready to proceed. She lifted her microphone and addressed the crowd with professional warmth that suggested she had not just witnessed one of the most dramatic wedding confrontations in Portland's social history. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to invite our bride and groom to the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. Please give a warm round of applause for Mr. and Mrs. James Montgomery as they dance to At Last by Etta James." The applause that followed was stronger than the polite acknowledgement that had greeted our cake cutting, perhaps because this moment felt more genuinely emotional despite everything that had preceded it. We walked together onto the empty dance floor, suddenly alone in the center of the vast space with hundreds of eyes watching our every movement. The opening notes of the song began, that distinctive orchestral introduction that builds slowly before Etta James's powerful voice enters, and James took me in his arms in the traditional waltz position we had practiced during our dance lessons 3 months earlier. We began to move together, our bodies remembering the steps even though our minds were occupied with thoughts far removed from choreography. James held me carefully, maintaining the proper distance and frame that our instructor had drilled into us. And I realized with sudden clarity that this physical distance represented the emotional distance that had opened between us. We were going through the motions of intimacy and partnership while actually maintaining separation, protecting ourselves from further hurt by keeping each other at arm's length both literally and figuratively. "This is ridiculous," I whispered as we turned slowly across the dance floor. aware of the photographer circling us to capture every angle. We are dancing at our own wedding like polite strangers rather than people who have been living together for 2 years, who know each other's bodies better than our own, who have shared everything from daily routines to future dreams. We have shared everything except the truth about who you actually are, James replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. I thought I knew you, Alex. I thought I understood where you came from, what you valued, what shaped you into the person you became. And now I discover that almost everything I believed about your background and circumstances was false, and I have to question what else I might be wrong about. The words hit harder than I expected, forcing me to confront the full impact of my choices in ways I had been avoiding. I had told myself that my modest lifestyle was authentic because I genuinely lived it, that my values and character were real even if the financial circumstances I presented were misleading. But James was right that I had allowed him to build an understanding of me based on partial information, and that understanding had influenced how he saw our relationship, what he thought he was choosing when he chose me. I am still the same person you fell in love with, I said, desperately wanting this to be true even as I recognized its insufficiency. My background is different than you thought, yes, but everything else is real. The way I teach my students, the values I hold, the reasons I love you, none of that changes because you now know I have money in the bank that I chose not to spend. Everything changes, James said flatly. You let me worry about you living in that apartment in a neighborhood I thought was unsafe. You let me feel guilty about taking you to expensive restaurants because I thought you could not afford that kind of dining on your own. You accepted my help and concern and protection like you needed those things from me. And now I find out you were playing a role the entire time, pretending to be someone you are not. I was not pretending, I insisted, even as I recognized the truth in his accusation. I was living the life I chose, and that life was real even if it was not necessary. The apartment was my home, not a performance piece. The teaching job was my career, not a costume I wore to deceive you. I was being authentic about what mattered to me, about how I wanted to live, even if I was not being fully transparent about the resources I had available. We continued dancing as this difficult conversation unfolded in whispers, our bodies moving through the choreographed routine, while our words carved away at the foundations of trust and understanding. Around us, other couples had joined the dance floor as tradition dictated, giving us some small measure of privacy as we were no longer the sole focus of attention. I caught glimpses of my parents dancing nearby, their movements easy and natural after decades of partnership, and felt a sharp pang of longing for that kind of established certainty, that earned comfort with each other that allowed them to navigate difficulty without questioning everything. The song built toward its climax, Etta James's voice soaring over the orchestration with declarations of love, finally found after years of loneliness and waiting. The lyrics that had seemed perfect when I selected this song now felt like an indictment, a promise of certainty and completion that seemed impossibly naive, given the uncertainty and incompleteness currently defining our relationship. When the final notes faded and we stopped moving, standing together on the dance floor while the crowd applauded, I felt tears threatening for the first time since my father had arrived and transformed the evening so completely. James must have seen something in my expression because his own face softened slightly, the anger and hurt giving way momentarily to concern. "Do not cry," he said quietly. "Not here, not now. Not where everyone can see and interpret, and add it to their growing collection of dramatic moments from the Montgomery wedding disaster." I blinked back the tears through sheer force of will, calling on years of practice maintaining composure in difficult situations. "I am not crying," I lied. "I am just overwhelmed by everything that has happened tonight, by how different this day has been from anything I imagined." "You and me both," James said, and there was something almost like dark humor in his voice, an acknowledgement that the absurdity of our situation had reached levels that transcended simple tragedy and entered some other territory entirely. The band leader announced the father-daughter and mother-son dances, the next ritual in the evening's progression. I felt my stomach clench at the thought of James dancing with Vivian after everything that had transpired, wondered if he would be able to maintain civility, or if the accumulated resentment would finally break through his careful control. My own father approached and offered his hand with a small smile that managed to convey both support and apology, as though he was sorry for the dramatic way he had revealed information but not sorry for the revelation itself. "May I have this dance with my daughter?" he asked formally, and I took his hand gratefully, allowing him to lead me back onto the dance floor while James crossed the room toward where his mother sat rigidly at her table, her expression unreadable from this distance. The music began, a slower song that the band leader had selected as appropriate for parent dances, and my father and I began moving together with the ease of long familiarity. He had taught me to dance when I was 4 years old, standing on his shoes as he waltzed me around our living room, and despite decades of professional success and accumulated wealth, he had never been too busy or important to spend time with his daughter when she needed him. "I am sorry for the timing of my arrival," he said quietly as we danced. "If I had been here earlier, if I had been present during the ceremony and the initial reception, perhaps I could have prevented what happened, could have spoken with Vivian privately, made clear what she was dealing with before she embarrassed herself publicly." I shook my head. It needed to happen the way it happened. If you had told her privately, she would have adjusted her approach, found new ways to undermine me that took my background into account. This way, everyone saw exactly who she is and what she is capable of. There is no denying it, no rewriting the narrative to make herself look better. She revealed her character in front of 200 witnesses, and that revelation cannot be taken back or softened. "Perhaps," my father acknowledged, "but revelation always comes at a cost, and I fear you are paying that cost now in your relationship with James. He feels betrayed by your secrecy, and that feeling is not unjustified even if your motives for maintaining privacy were understandable." "I know," I said quietly. "I am not sure how to fix it, how to rebuild trust when the foundation was apparently more fragile than I realized. He keeps saying I was pretending, playing a role, and maybe he is right. Maybe I was so focused on being loved for the right reasons that I created a false version of myself, and now he does not know which parts were real and which parts were performance." My father was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful as we continued moving across the dance floor. "When your mother and I met, I was working as a technician making $12 an hour, living in a shared apartment with 3 other immigrants, eating instant noodles for most meals. She was a graduate student in mathematics at the university, from a family that was not wealthy but comfortable, educated, established in ways I was not. Her parents were not enthusiastic about her dating a poor immigrant with uncertain prospects, thought she could do better, should choose someone from her own background who understood American culture, and had established professional credentials. I had heard this story before but recognized that he was telling it again with specific purpose, drawing parallels to my own situation that I was meant to understand and learn from. Your mother could have hidden her relationship with me from her family, could have kept me separate from that part of her life until I was more established, more successful, more acceptable by their standards. But she did not. She brought me home within a month of our first date, introduced me to her parents and siblings, and made clear that I was important to her regardless of their approval. And because she did that, because she was honest and direct from the beginning, there was no moment of dramatic revelation, no discovery that changed how people understood her or our relationship. There was just reality, transparent and uncomfortable, but at least honest. "You are saying I should have told James and his family the truth from the start," I said, understanding the lesson even as I resisted its implications. That by trying to protect myself and test whether I could be loved without wealth influencing the relationship, I actually created a bigger problem than honesty would have caused. "I am saying that authenticity requires vulnerability," my father said gently. "You wanted to be loved for yourself, but you showed James only part of yourself and expected him to love the complete person you never fully revealed. That is not fair to him, and it is not sustainable for a real relationship built on genuine knowledge of each other." The dance concluded and my father kissed my forehead with the same gentle affection he had shown throughout my life, during childhood victories and teenage heartbreaks and every significant moment in between. "You will work this out," he said with quiet confidence. "You and James chose each other for real reasons, and those reasons still exist beneath the confusion and hurt. But it will require both of you to be more honest than you have been, about your fears and insecurities, and the ways you have protected yourselves at each other's expense. Marriage is not about finding someone who completes you or fixes you or requires nothing difficult from you. It is about finding someone worth being uncomfortable with, worth changing for, worth the hard work of building something together that neither of you could create alone." I watched him walk back toward my mother, their hands finding each other naturally, their bodies moving together with the synchronization that comes from decades of partnership. Then I turned to find James, ready to continue with whatever remained of this impossibly difficult evening, uncertain about what came next but at least clear that we could not move forward without confronting the difficult truths that had emerged tonight. The parent dances concluded with polite applause that felt increasingly automatic as the evening wore on, each ritual observed and completed with diminishing enthusiasm from guests, who were clearly more interested in discussing the dramatic confrontation than in celebrating traditional wedding milestones. I watched James escort his mother back to her table, their body language stiff and uncomfortable, maintaining physical distance even as they moved through the crowd together. Vivian's face remained composed in that way wealthy women master early, revealing nothing of whatever emotions churned beneath the surface, though her eyes betrayed something that might have been shock or anger or humiliation so profound it had moved beyond simple embarrassment into territory that could not be adequately named. Charles Montgomery had disappeared at some point during the dances, and I spotted him now standing near the bar in conversation with several men I recognized as business associates, their heads bent together in the kind of intense discussion that suggested they were analyzing the evening's events with the same strategic calculation they would apply to a failed business deal. They glanced periodically toward our table, toward Vivian sitting alone, toward my father who had resumed his seat beside my mother, and I could practically see them recalibrating their understanding of social hierarchies and family alliances based on information that had fundamentally altered the landscape they thought they understood. I moved through the crowd toward the ladies' room, needing a moment away from constant observation and the weight of performing normalcy when nothing about this evening felt normal anymore. My bridesmaids, who had been remarkably absent during the major confrontations, seemed to sense my need for escape and created a casual barrier between me and other guests, their bodies forming a protective semicircle that allowed me to reach the hallway leading to the restrooms without being stopped for conversation or congratulations that would feel hollow given the circumstances. The bathroom was blessedly empty, offering temporary sanctuary from the performance I had been maintaining for hours. I stood at the marble sink counter, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror and trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. My makeup remained flawless thanks to the expensive products and professional application I had insisted upon, my hair still perfectly arranged despite hours of stress and emotion, my dress showing no signs of the inner turmoil that threatened to overwhelm me if I allowed my carefully constructed composure to crack even slightly. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, a beautiful bride on her wedding day, radiantly happy and beginning a new chapter with the man she loved. The disconnect between appearance and reality felt almost physically painful. The door opened behind me and I turned to see Sophia Chan, my closest friend since college and one of my bridesmaids, entering with an expression that combined concern and something that looked almost like admiration. Sophia was one of the few people who had known the truth about my background from the beginning, had watched me make the decision to live modestly and hide my wealth, and had questioned that choice repeatedly over the years we had been friends. She had argued that I was setting myself up for exactly this kind of dramatic revelation, that truth always emerged eventually and controlled disclosure was better than explosive discovery. I had dismissed her concerns, convinced my approach was principled and sustainable. Now her presence in this bathroom felt like a silent statement of validation, an acknowledgement that she had been right and I had been wrong without needing to speak the words aloud. "Are you okay?" she asked, which was possibly the most inadequate question given the circumstances but also the only question that mattered in this moment. That was the most dramatic thing I have ever witnessed in person, and I once attended a wedding where the bride's ex-boyfriend objected during the ceremony and tried to physically carry her out of the church. Despite everything, I felt a small laugh escape, surprising myself with the capacity for humor even in such dire circumstances. I think we have definitely set a new standard for Portland wedding disasters. People will be telling stories about this reception for decades, using it as the benchmark against which all other family drama is measured. Sophia moved to stand beside me at the counter, meeting my eyes in the mirror rather than turning to face me directly. "For what it is worth, I think your father is magnificent. The way he walked in here, the timing of it, the precision with which he dismantled every assumption Vivian had been operating under. It was like watching a master class in strategic information deployment. I have never seen someone so thoroughly destroyed with nothing but factual statements about trust funds and real estate holdings. He has been practicing that kind of strategic communication for 40 years in business negotiations," I said quietly. When he walked in and saw what was happening, Saw his daughter being publicly humiliated at her own wedding reception. He deployed every skill he has ever developed to protect me. I should feel grateful, and I do, but I also feel like maybe the protection came at too high a cost. What cost? Sophia asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Vivian humiliated herself. She revealed exactly what kind of person she is to everyone who matters in her social world. You did not do that to her. Your father did not do that to her. She did that entirely on her own by choosing to attack you publicly based on assumptions she never bothered to verify. The cost is James, I said, finally articulating the fear that had been growing throughout the evening. He looked at me during our first dance like he did not know who I was, like I was a stranger wearing his wife's face. He keeps saying I was pretending, performing, being someone I am not, and maybe he is right. Maybe by hiding my background I was being fundamentally dishonest in ways that are incompatible with real intimacy and trust. Sophia turned to face me directly now, her expression serious and intent. Alex, listen to me. You were not being dishonest about anything that matters. You were living the life you chose to live, pursuing the career you cared about, making decisions based on your values rather than your bank account. That is the opposite of pretending. That is being authentic about what actually defines you as a person rather than allowing wealth to be your primary characteristic. But I let him believe things about me that were not true, I protested. I let him think I struggled financially when I did not. I let him worry about me and feel protective toward me in ways that were based on false assumptions about my circumstances. That is dishonesty even if it was not outright lying. It is strategic privacy, Sophia countered. It is maintaining boundaries around information that people use to make judgments that have nothing to do with your actual character or worth. You have spent 3 years proving that James loves you for real reasons, for who you are rather than what you have, and now he is upset because he discovered you have more than he thought? That is his problem, not yours. If he cannot handle the fact that his wife is wealthy and successful in her own right, if he needs you to be less than him in order to feel comfortable, then maybe this marriage is not going to work regardless of what happened tonight. Her words were sharp and defensive in the way that close friends become when they perceive someone they care about being hurt, but I recognized that her analysis was too simplistic, too willing to dismiss James's legitimate feelings of betrayal. It is not about him needing me to be less than him, I said slowly, working through my thoughts as I spoke them. It is about him feeling like he made decisions based on incomplete information, like he was operating in a relationship where he thought we were being transparent with each other, but actually I was holding back significant parts of my identity and history. Everyone holds back parts of themselves, Sophia argued. That is what privacy means. You do not owe anyone complete access to every aspect of your life, just because you are in a relationship with them. You get to decide what you share and when you share it, and the fact that you chose to keep your wealth private does not make you dishonest or manipulative. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the absolution she was offering and frame my choices as reasonable boundary setting rather than problematic deception. But I could not shake the image of James's face during our dance, the hurt and confusion that suggested something fundamental had been damaged between us, something that might not be easily repaired even with good intentions and difficult conversations. I need to get back out there, I said, straightening my dress and checking my reflection one final time to ensure no signs of distress were visible. We still have toasts to get through, and more dancing, and probably another hour at minimum before we can reasonably leave without it looking like we are fleeing our own wedding reception. Do you want me to run interference? Sophia asked. Keep people away from you. Deflect conversations that are heading toward uncomfortable territory. Generally act as a human shield between you and anyone who wants to discuss what happened with Vivian. No, I said, making the decision even as I spoke. I need to face this directly, need to show everyone that I am not ashamed of who I am, or where I come from, or the choices I made. Hiding or avoiding will only feed speculation, and make me look like I have something to be embarrassed about. I am going to walk back into that ballroom with my head up and dare anyone to say something to my face about gold digging or deception or whatever other narrative they are constructing to make sense of tonight. Sophia smiled with genuine approval. That is the Alex I know. The one who does not back down or apologize for being exactly who she is, regardless of who that makes uncomfortable. We returned to the reception together, and I was immediately aware of the shift in energy that occurred when I entered the room. Conversations paused mid-sentence, people turned to track my movement, and I could feel the weight of speculation and judgment and fascinated curiosity following me like a physical presence. I kept my expression neutral and confident, channeling every lesson I had learned growing up about how to move through social situations where you were being evaluated and discussed, where any sign of weakness or uncertainty would be noted and used against you. James was back at our table, and I slid into the seat beside him with what I hoped looked like natural ease. He glanced at me, his expression still guarded but perhaps slightly less hostile than it had been during our dance. "Your father wants to make a toast," he said quietly. "Michelle says we are ahead of schedule somehow, despite everything that has happened, and the best man toasts are next on the agenda. Your father asked if he could speak as well, and I said yes because I could not think of a polite way to refuse." I nodded, recognizing that my father making a toast after his dramatic entrance and revelations would either help contextualize the evening or make things even more complicated, and there was no way to predict which outcome would occur. Robert Chun was brilliant at reading rooms and calibrating his message to his audience, but he was also fiercely protective of his daughter, and might say things that felt satisfying in the moment but created additional problems later. Jordan Williams, James's best man and friend since high school, approached the microphone that had been set up near the head table for toasts. Jordan was a corporate attorney with one of Portland's prestigious law firms, someone who moved in the same social circles as the Montgomery family and understood their world intimately. I had always liked Jordan, appreciated his straightforward personality and the genuine affection he showed for James, and I hoped his toast would be one of normalcy in an evening that had been anything but normal. "Good evening, everyone," Jordan began, his voice carrying easily across the now quiet ballroom. "For those who do not know me, I am Jordan Williams, and I have had the privilege of being James's friend for the past 18 years. We met during freshman orientation at Stanford, bonded over our shared inability to surf despite growing up on the West Coast, and have been close ever since." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. Jordan was setting a tone of lightness and affection, steering away from the drama that had dominated the evening and back toward celebration of the relationship that had brought us all here. "I have watched James date a lot of women over the years," Jordan continued, and I saw Vivian's face tighten at this reference to her son's romantic history. "Some were brilliant, some were beautiful, some were both. But none of them made him light up the way Alexandra does. I remember the first time he told me about her, maybe 2 weeks after they met. He called me at 11 at night, which James never does because he is usually asleep by 10, and he talked for an hour about this incredible woman he had met at a gallery opening. A woman who was smart and funny and passionate about teaching art to children, who made him think about things differently, who challenged his assumptions about what mattered in life." Jordan paused, looking directly at me with an expression of warmth and sincerity. "Alex, you made my best friend better. You made him more thoughtful, more generous, more willing to question the bubble he grew up in and consider perspectives beyond what he had always known. You expanded his world in ways that matter, in ways that have nothing to do with money or status or any of the superficial things that sometimes dominate the circles we move in. And for that, I will always be grateful to you." I felt tears threatening again and blinked them back determinately, refusing to cry during what was supposed to be a celebratory toast. James's hand found mine under the table, his fingers interlacing with mine in the first spontaneously affectionate gesture he had initiated since my father's revelations. The contact felt like forgiveness, or at least like the possibility of forgiveness, like an acknowledgement that whatever hurt and confusion existed between us might not be insurmountable. "So I would like to raise my glass," Jordan said, lifting his champagne flute, "to James and Alexandra, to a marriage built on genuine love and respect, on real knowledge of each other's character rather than assumptions about circumstances, to partnership that weathers difficulty and emerges stronger, to choosing each other every day, even when that choice is complicated or uncomfortable, to a lifetime of expanding worlds and challenging assumptions and making each other better. Congratulations, and may your love continue to grow deeper and more authentic with each passing year." The room erupted in applause and raised glasses, people drinking to the toast with enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than obligatory. I sipped my champagne and felt something loosen in my chest, some tight knot of anxiety that had been constricting my breathing since Vivian's initial attack. Jordan had reframed the evening beautifully, had taken the disaster of exposed secrets and transformed it into a story about authenticity and genuine connection, about love that transcended superficial considerations. As Jordan returned to his seat, my father stood and moved toward the microphone. The room fell silent immediately, everyone leaning forward slightly in anticipation of what he might say, whether he would address the confrontation directly or pretend it had not occurred. I held my breath, trusting my father but also aware that he was capable of saying things that were devastatingly effective but not always tactful. "Thank you, Jordan, for that beautiful toast," my father began, his voice calm and measured. "I am Robert Chun, Alexandra's father, and I apologize again for my late arrival this evening. I regret missing the ceremony, but I am grateful to be here now to celebrate my daughter's marriage to a man who clearly loves her deeply." He paused, looking around the room with the same assessing gaze I had seen him use in business meetings when he was taking the measure of people and situations. I have been asked many times over the years why I supported Alexandra's decision to live modestly and pursue teaching rather than joining the family business or pursuing a more lucrative career. People have suggested I was being neglectful, that I should have insisted she take advantage of the resources available to her, that I was doing her a disservice by allowing her to struggle when struggle was unnecessary. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone focused completely on my father's words. I could see Vivian watching him with an expression that suggested she was bracing for another attack, another revelation that would further expose her mistakes and assumptions. "But I supported her choice," my father continued, "because I understood what she was trying to accomplish. She wanted to know who she was separate from wealth, wanted to build an identity based on her own choices and accomplishments, rather than her family's resources. She wanted to be certain that the people in her life cared about her for authentic reasons rather than for what she could provide or what connection she represented. That is not a character flaw. That is wisdom, maturity, and self-awareness that many people never develop even over an entire lifetime." He turned to look at me directly, his expression soft with paternal affection. "Alexandra, you have lived these past years with integrity and purpose, staying true to your values even when it would have been easier to take advantage of resources you did not need but certainly had access to. You have taught children who needed you, donated resources to causes that mattered to you, and built a life based on what you believed was meaningful rather than what others thought was impressive. I could not be more proud of the woman you have become." I felt tears spill over despite my best efforts to contain them, moved by my father's public validation and the way he had transformed my choices into something honorable rather than problematic. James's hand tightened on mine, and when I glanced at his face I saw his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And James," my father said, shifting his attention to my husband, "you chose my daughter when you thought she had nothing but herself to offer. You loved her for her character, her intelligence, her kindness, her passion for teaching. That choice reveals everything important about who you are and what you value. The fact that she happens to have substantial resources does not change the authenticity of that choice or the validity of what you built together." My father raised his glass, preparing for his toast. "So I would like to say to everyone here tonight, judge people by their character, not their circumstances. Evaluate relationships by their substance, not their surface appearance. And remember that the most valuable things in life, love and integrity and genuine connection, cannot be bought or measured in financial terms. To James and Alexandra, may your marriage be rich in all the ways that truly matter." The applause that followed was thunderous, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that felt like vindication and validation and collective acknowledgement that despite the evening's chaos, something true and important had been celebrated. I stood with James, both of us accepting the applause while trying not to appear too emotional, trying to maintain some semblance of composure even as we were overwhelmed by the unexpected support. As people resumed their seats and conversations, as the band began playing again and the party atmosphere gradually reasserted itself, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps the evening would not end in complete disaster. Perhaps the dramatic revelations and difficult confrontations would ultimately strengthen rather than destroy what James and I had built together. Perhaps Vivian's attack had forced into the open issues that needed to be addressed, secrets that needed to be shared, and honest conversations that needed to happen for our marriage to have a real foundation. James leaned close, his lips near my ear so he could be heard over the music. "We still need to talk about everything, about why you hid this and what it means going forward. But Alex, I do love you. That much I am certain about, even if I am confused and hurt about everything else. Your father was right that I chose you for real reasons, and those reasons still exist even now that I know the whole truth." "I love you too," I said, turning my head so our foreheads touched briefly, a moment of intimacy in the midst of public performance. "And I promise no more secrets. No more strategic omissions or careful management of information. Whatever you want to know, however difficult the conversation, I will be completely honest from now on." "Starting tomorrow," James said with a small smile that suggested perhaps his sense of humor was beginning to reassert itself. "Tonight we just need to survive the rest of this reception without any additional disasters. I think we have reached our quota for dramatic revelations and family confrontations for at least the next decade." I laughed quietly, relieved to hear something approaching lightness in his voice. "Agreed. No more drama tonight. Just cake and dancing and pretending everything is normal until we can finally escape to our hotel suite and process everything that has happened in private." We turned our attention back to the reception, watching guests mingle and dance and gradually relax as alcohol and time softened the sharp edges of earlier confrontations. I observed Vivian still sitting rigidly at her table, isolated despite being surrounded by people, her public humiliation creating a barrier that made casual interaction impossible. Part of me felt vindicated seeing her face consequences for her behavior, but another part recognized that her pain was real regardless of whether it was deserved, and that destroyed relationships were never truly victorious, even when they represented justice being served. The remainder of the evening unfolded with determined normalcy, each scheduled event completed on time as though nothing unusual had occurred. More toasts were delivered, more dances were danced, more photographs were taken that would later be carefully selected to present an image of joy and celebration, while excluding any evidence of the drama that had defined the actual experience. And through it all, I maintained my composure and smiled my practiced smile and played the role of happy bride with enough conviction that eventually even I almost believed it. The reception had entered its final hour when I noticed the first unmistakable signs that Vivian Montgomery was beginning to unravel in ways that went beyond the immediate shock of public humiliation. She had remained seated at her table for most of the evening following my father's toast, nursing what appeared to be her fourth or fifth glass of wine while friends and acquaintances approached with expressions that ranged from sympathetic concern to barely concealed schadenfreude. Each conversation seemed to drain something from her, leaving her posture increasingly slouched and her carefully maintained composure showing visible cracks that would have been unthinkable earlier in the evening when she had stood in the center of the dance floor radiating righteous indignation. I was standing near the dessert table with several of my teaching colleagues who had been invited to the wedding, women who knew me only as Alex the art teacher, and who were clearly struggling to reconcile that identity with the revelations about trust funds and commercial real estate holdings. They were asking polite questions about my background, trying to understand how someone with such substantial wealth had ended up teaching second graders for $38,000 a year, and I was attempting to explain my reasoning in ways that did not sound condescending or like I was romanticizing poverty from a position of privilege. That was when I saw Vivian stand abruptly, swaying slightly as though the room had tilted beneath her feet. Her hand reached out to steady herself on the table edge, and several people nearby turned to look with expressions of concern. Charles, who had been standing across the room in conversation with business associates, noticed his wife's distress and began moving toward her, but she waved him away with a gesture that was meant to appear dismissive but came across as desperate. "I need some air," I heard her say, her voice carrying across the room with unexpected volume. "It is insufferably hot in here. Does no one else feel how hot it is?" The ballroom was actually quite cool, the air conditioning set to compensate for the body heat of 200 guests, and several people exchanged glances that suggested they recognized Vivian's complaint as something other than an accurate assessment of temperature. She began walking toward the terrace doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking the river, her gait unsteady in her designer heels, and I watched with a mixture of concern and fascination as she navigated through clusters of guests who parted to let her pass while watching her progress with undisguised interest. James had been talking with Jordan near the bar, but he noticed his mother's strange behavior and broke off mid-conversation to follow her path across the ballroom. I excused myself from my colleagues and moved to intercept him, catching his arm before he could reach the terrace. Maybe give her a moment alone, I suggested quietly. She is humiliated and processing, and having you witness her breakdown might make things worse rather than better. She is drunk, James said flatly, watching through the glass doors as his mother gripped the terrace railing with both hands, her shoulders heaving in a way that suggested she might be crying or struggling not to vomit or both. I have never seen her have more than 2 glasses of wine in an evening. She is always so controlled, so careful about maintaining appearances. This is completely unlike her. She just had her entire social identity destroyed in front of everyone who matters in her world. I pointed out, trying for compassion despite my complicated feelings about Vivian's earlier behavior. People do not always react rationally when they are facing that kind of comprehensive humiliation. Maybe she needs to fall apart a little before she can start putting herself back together. James looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Something between gratitude for my understanding and resentment that I was being generous toward someone who had tried to publicly destroy me hours earlier. You are being remarkably gracious about this, considering what she did to you. Most people would be enjoying watching her suffer, would see this as justice or karma or whatever term we use to make ourselves feel better about taking satisfaction in others' pain. I am not most people, I said quietly. And I do not take satisfaction in watching anyone suffer, even someone who tried to hurt me. Your mother made terrible choices tonight based on assumptions that were wrong, and she is facing consequences that feel disproportionately harsh, even if they are technically deserved. That does not make me happy. It just makes me sad that things had to unfold this way rather than through honest conversation and mutual respect. Before James could respond, Charles Montgomery pushed past us and strode onto the terrace where his wife stood alone. We could see him speaking to her urgently, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that could have been comfort or restraint. Vivian shook her head violently, pulling away from his touch, and even through the closed glass doors we could hear her raised voice, though not the specific words she was saying. "This is a disaster," James muttered, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration I had learned to recognize over our 3 years together. Our wedding reception is going to be remembered as the night my mother had a public meltdown and accused my wife of being a gold digger, only to discover that my wife is actually wealthier than our entire family. People will be talking about this for years, and not in ways that reflect well on anyone involved. People will talk regardless, I said pragmatically. That is what people do when they witness dramatic events involving wealthy families and social hierarchies being upended. We cannot control the narrative or prevent speculation. We can only control how we respond and whether we allow other people's opinions to define our experience or our relationship. Michelle, the wedding planner, appeared at my elbow with her tablet and an expression that suggested she was earning every penny of her substantial fee tonight. "Mrs. Montgomery, we are approaching the scheduled end time for the reception. The band is prepared to play for another 30 minutes if you would like to extend, or we can begin encouraging guests to depart and transition to the farewell portion of the evening. What would you prefer?" I looked at James, silently asking for his input on this decision that would determine how much longer we needed to maintain our performance of normalcy. He glanced toward the terrace where his parents were still engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion, then back at the ballroom where guests were beginning to show signs of fatigue and overindulgence, conversations growing louder and less filtered as alcohol eroded the social restraint that had kept most people from directly addressing the evening's drama. "Let us begin the farewell process," James decided. "We have done everything required by tradition and expectation. Staying longer just gives people more opportunity to drink too much and say things they will regret tomorrow, or to approach us with questions and comments we are not prepared to address graciously." Michelle nodded and spoke quietly into her headset, initiating whatever sequence of events signaled to staff and band that the evening was entering its final phase. The music shifted to slower songs that encouraged remaining dancers to pair up for final dances, while others began gathering belongings and saying goodbyes. I noticed my parents making their way toward us, my mother's face showing the strain of maintaining social composure through an evening that had been far more stressful than any wedding reception had a right to be. "Are you ready to leave?" my father asked when they reached us, his hand settling on my shoulder in a gesture of protective concern. "Your mother and I can stay as long as you need us, but you also do not have to remain until the absolute last guest departs." You have fulfilled your obligations as hosts, and everyone will understand if you want to escape to your hotel suite and process everything that has happened in private. We are ready, I confirmed, feeling exhaustion settle over me like a physical weight now that departure was imminent and I could begin to let go of the tension I had been holding throughout the evening. James and I need time alone to talk about everything, to figure out how we move forward from here without the pressure of public observation and performance. My mother pulled me into a tight embrace, holding me longer than was probably necessary but offering the kind of maternal comfort I had been too proud to seek earlier in the evening. You handled yourself beautifully tonight, Alexandra, with dignity and grace even when others were behaving badly. Your father and I are so proud of who you are, and how you conducted yourself through circumstances that would have broken someone with less strength of character. I felt tears threatening again and blinked them back determinately, refusing to cry at my own wedding reception, even tears of gratitude and emotional release. Thank you for coming, for supporting me, for understanding why I made the choices I made even when you disagreed with them. And Dad, thank you for arriving when you did, even though the timing was dramatic. I think I needed someone to fight for me in that moment, to make clear that I was not going to accept being diminished or dismissed regardless of what anyone assumed about my background or worth. You should never have to accept being treated that way, my father said firmly. From anyone, under any circumstances. The fact that it was your mother-in-law makes it more complicated but not more acceptable. She owes you an apology, and until she offers one that is genuine and comprehensive, I would suggest maintaining significant distance from her regardless of how that impacts family dynamics. James, who had been listening to this exchange, shifted uncomfortably. She is still my mother. Whatever mistakes she made tonight, whatever damage she caused, I cannot simply cut her out of my life because she behaved badly. Family is more complicated than that, and relationships cannot be ended just because someone shows their worst self in a moment of weakness. Calling your wife a gold digger in front of 200 people is not a moment of weakness, my father said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized as the tone he used in business negotiations when someone had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. It is a calculated attack designed to humiliate and undermine, and the fact that it backfired spectacularly does not change the intention behind it. Vivian revealed exactly what she thinks of Alexandra, and exactly how far she was willing to go to damage your marriage. That is not something that can be dismissed or forgiven lightly simply because she is family. Dad, I interrupted gently, recognizing that this conversation was heading toward conflict that would not serve anyone well in this moment. James and I will figure out how to handle his relationship with his mother. That is our decision to make together, and we will make it based on what we think is right for our marriage and our family going forward. But right now we just need to get through the goodbyes and escape to somewhere private where we can finally stop performing and be honest with each other about how we are really feeling. My father nodded, accepting the boundary I had drawn even though his expression suggested he had more opinions he was holding back. Of course, we will talk more later, after you have had time to process with James. But know that your mother and I support whatever decisions you make about how to navigate these relationships, and we will be here whenever you need us. They moved away to begin their own goodbyes, and I turned to find Jordan approaching with his girlfriend, a corporate consultant named Melissa whom I had met several times at group dinners and always found intelligent and enjoyable company. They both hugged me and offered congratulations that felt more genuine than most of the well wishes I had received throughout the evening, perhaps because they were among the few people present who knew both James and me well enough to understand the complexity of what we were navigating. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.